Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, there is something particularly disquieting about a lost library. Not the kind lost to fire or earthquake or time, though those fates are tragic enough, but a library that vanishes quietly, deliberately, almost surgically, we knowledge, is not destroyed in a blaze, but allowed to drift into irrelevance, buried beneath politics, language shifts, and changing orthodoxy. And that's precisely what happened in the early centuries after the fall of Rome. You might imagine a crumbling empire scattered its books like autumn leaves, windswept and wild. But the truth is more methodical, more disappointing. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, the libraries didn't burn overnight. Most of them weren't even touched. In fact, many remained perfectly intact for decades, some for centuries. But people stopped reading them, not because the texts were unimportant. They were full of mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, engineering, but they were written in Greek, a language that fewer and fewer people in the Latin West could understand. The scribes of the early medieval period, often monks in secluded monasteries, focused their efforts on Latin theological texts, transcriptions of the Bible, commentaries by Augustine, lexicographies of saints. Greek. That was the language of the East, of Byzantium, heretics. So the texts of Aristotle, Archimedes, Galen, and Ptolemy were quietly sidelined, not burned, not banned, just ... neglected. They sat on shelves in ancient Roman villas turned monasteries. They faded. Mice chewed their corners. Ink peeled. Parchments dried and crumbled. This wasn't dramatic destruction. It was something worse. It was apathy. You probably know the names of famous library losses. Alexandria is famously burned, though, more than once, and perhaps less than we think. The Library of Antioch. The library at Pergamon. But what about the lesser-known repositories? The villa libraries of wealthy Roman nobles. The municipal libraries in southern Gaul. The private collections maintained by senators and retired generals. No fire touched them. They were inherited, abandoned, reabsorbed into church land. And the books, hundreds of thousands of them, were lost, not by violence, but by disinterest. In the monastery of Bobbio, tucked in the Apennine Mountains, monks in the 7th century preserved some of the last remaining texts of classical antiquity, almost by accident. They used blank pages from ancient manuscripts as binding materials for their new Latin texts. Sometimes the original words were still faintly visible underneath the ink of the Psalms. Palimpsests, they're called, erased parchments. Imagine erasing a book by Cicero so you can copy a homily by Jerome. That wasn't malice. That was practicality. Parchment was expensive. The old texts were pagan. They served no function in the new world of saints and miracles. But here's the twist. The knowledge wasn't entirely gone. It wasn't wiped out. It was just shelved in the wrong language, in the wrong context, under the wrong value system. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, Greek texts still had a life. Scholars preserved them, debated them, but even their access was limited. Most common folk were illiterate. Manuscripts were copied slowly, by hand, one by one, and then came war. The sack of Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204 would scatter what remained to the winds of Europe. But let's not jump ahead. Let's go back to the 8th century, the heart of what we later called the Dark Ages, a term now debated, even frowned upon by modern historians. Because it's not that people were ignorant. They were just focused elsewhere. Agricultural manuals were copied, calendars, religious laws. But what about the hydraulic treatises of Hero of Alexandria? His notes on water organs and steam-powered automata? What about the mechanical writings of Vitruvius or the precise observations of Hipparchus? They survived, some of them in dusty copies hidden in southern Italian monasteries, or as incomplete fragments. Others disappeared entirely. And here's what's strange. People didn't know they had forgotten them. That's the quiet horror of this moment in history. Not that knowledge was lost, but that no one noticed its absence. Think about that. Imagine a world where the geometry of Euclid is forgotten for 600 years, where the Earth's circumference, once calculated by Eratosthenes in 240 BCE, is treated as unknowable. Imagine farmers using Roman aqueducts but not understanding how they were built. Imagine a cathedral rising above a town, its buttresses awe-inspiring, but no one knowing the mechanics behind the arches they had inherited. That was Europe in the early medieval centuries. Not dark, but dim. Dim with reverence, dim with ritual, dim with copied scripture and flickering oil lamps, but dim nonetheless. There were exceptions, of course. The Venerable Bede, writing in 8th century Northumbria, tried to calculate time using fragments of Roman astronomical knowledge. Charlemagne's court brought scholars like Alcuin of York to preserve some classical logic and grammar. But these were isolated candles. The bonfire of classical learning had not been extinguished by flame. It had simply burned down ember by ember until most people forgot there had ever been a blaze. Why didn't they care? Because the world had changed. Empires had fallen, cities had emptied, roads decayed, trade collapsed, survival took precedence. People farmed, prayed, endured. Who needs a treatise on planetary motion when you're trying to survive a crop failure? Copies Ptolemy when your local bishop tells you salvation matters more than astronomy. And so the texts were forgotten, not because they were false, but because they were irrelevant to a world now shaped by different concerns. And yet, it's a sense of unease in this forgetting, because we didn't lose stories or legends. We lost the mechanics of how the world works. We lost hydraulics, geometry, astronomy, medicine. We lost the means of measuring the stars and building aqueducts. And in doing so, we had to rediscover them centuries later, at great cost. But that's another story. This one, this quiet beginning, ends with a question. What else sat forgotten on those monastery shelves, erased, overwritten, and lost, before anyone remembered to ask where it had gone? If you could walk silently into a scriptorium in the 9th century, you might be surprised at what you wouldn't see. You wouldn't see bustling scholars discussing the theories of Plato. You wouldn't hear debates about the motion of celestial spheres or the properties of water under pressure. You wouldn't see the names of Aristotle or Galen scattered across the desks. Instead, you'd hear the slow scratch of a stylus or quill across parchment. A monk with his cowl drawn low, copying, not with passion or curiosity, but with the patience of obedience. The third Latin revision of a Christian saint's life, perhaps the martyrdom of Saint Polycarp, or the mystical visions of a local bishop. To our modern eyes, it might feel like a loss, but to the monk, it was duty. Preservation of the soul, not science. The real stewards of forgotten knowledge weren't scholars anymore. They were scribes, quiet men, and sometimes women, who preserved what they understood to be useful, moral, or sacred. And much of what the classical world had written didn't fit the mold. Some of it was suspected of heresy. Some of it was so technical, it no longer made sense. Take, for instance, the survival of Lucretius de Rerum Natura, a Roman philosophical poem that describes the universe in atomistic terms. It proposed, quite boldly, that gods did not interfere in the world, that nature ran on its own logic, that death was simply the dispersal of atoms. This text was not preserved intentionally. It slipped through by chance, discovered centuries later in a remote German monastery by Pagaio Braugelin, a Renaissance book hunter. He had to decipher it from a manuscript riddled with damage and copied errors, tamed for the mere fact it survived. It all is a kind of miracle. But why was it hidden away? 'Cause monks, especially in the early Middle Ages, acted as filters, okay? And the criteria they used were moral, theological, sometimes political, not scientific. It's important to remember, monastic libraries were not libraries in the modern sense. They weren't public, nor were they organized around the idea of universal knowledge. They were curated repositories of texts deemed suitable for reflection, contemplation, or instruction. And here lies the crux of the loss. 1,000 decisions were made quietly by candlelight about what to copy and what to leave behind. One monk decides a treatise on medicinal herbs is too pagan. Another finds the diagrams of a mechanical pump too difficult to replicate. A third sees no spiritual merit in a treatise on eclipses. And so, without argument, without violence, knowledge withers. Not out of malice, but out of misalignment. Still, some of it remained, barely in the margins of Christian texts. Sometimes you find glosses, side notes, quoting earlier sources. A sentence from Seneca here, a line from Pliny there. They survived like fossils. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Empire, things were different, but not necessarily better. In Constantinople, scholars preserved Greek learning with more enthusiasm, but their own filters applied. Christian Byzantine scholars often rewrote or annotated classical texts through the lens of theology. Pagan thought was tolerated only when it could be harmonized with Christian dogma, and then came waves of instability, iconoclast movements, invasions, court intrigues. Each moment threatened the brittle survival of old texts. One fire in the 5th century destroyed the library of Constantinople's early archives. Later, the sack of Constantinople by Western Crusaders in 1204 caused irreparable damage to its libraries and archives. Manuscripts were looted, burned, or lost to the sea, but by then, some of those works had already taken a new route, east, into the Islamic world. Here, in the Abbasid Caliphate, the forgotten knowledge of Greece and Rome found new life in cities like Baghdad. The house of wisdom Beit al-Hikmah flourished. Scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, preserving, commenting, expanding, and for a while, the East became the bridge. Ptolemy, Galen, Euclid, and Aristotle returned, not through Rome, not through monasteries, but through Arabic manuscripts that had traveled through Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba. It is thanks to these scholars, men like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Al-Hazen, that the West would eventually rediscover its own past. But let's not leap too far ahead. Let's pause again in the year 1000. In a small monastery on the edge of the Alps, a monk is repairing the binding on a copy of Etymologia by Isidore of Seville, an encyclopedia of sorts, containing scraps of knowledge from earlier times. It is not original, but it is a lifeline. Isidore, writing in the 7th century, tried to save knowledge by summarizing it. His work includes fragments of Roman grammar, trivia about animals, celestial bodies, geography. It's riddled with inaccuracies and Christian allegory. But it was one of the most copied books of the Middle Ages, because sometimes, to survive, knowledge had to disguise itself. It had to be devotional. It had to sound like faith. Another survival strategy was embedding learning into liturgy, monastic timekeeping. The bells that marked canonical hours required an understanding of astronomy, so monks learned just enough to calculate sunrise and sunset. They learned to track equinoxes to fix Easter's day, not for curiosity's sake, but for worship. And yet, even this small necessity kept a flicker of scientific thought alive. In the Computus, medieval time-reckoning manuals, we see references to lunar cycles, solar tables, and even arithmetic. progressions. It wasn't astronomy in its full form, but it was a seed. Elsewhere, knowledge survived in disguise again in the art of building. Medieval architects inherited the principles of Roman engineering. Even if they couldn't explain them, they built arches, domes, aqueducts, sometimes more by intuition and tradition than formal geometry. But the forms endured, a kind of embodied knowledge, and in rare cases, the old texts reappeared. In the court of Charlemagne circa 800 AD, scholars attempted a revival of classical learning. They collected what Latin texts they could find, cleaned up corrupt copies, and established scriptoria to multiply them. It was called the Carolingian Renaissance. Modest in scope, but crucial, it standardized Latin handwriting, Carolingian, minuscule, which made later copying more legible. It preserved Cicero, Boethius, and Martianus Capella, but most Greek texts were still out of reach, because they weren't just written in another language, they were written in another worldview. The classical authors asked different questions. They observed nature without assuming divine intervention. They proposed models of physics, logic, medicine, not to save the soul, but to understand the world. This mindset, this curiosity, without immediate utility, didn't align well with medieval priorities, which is why their silence endured for so long. But cracks were forming in the 11th century. Scholars in Sicily and Spain began translating Arabic texts, which were themselves translations of Greek originals, back into Latin. A strange loop. Greek to Arabic to Latin. Each step introduced errors, glosses, reinterpretations, but it was enough. Slowly, the West began to remember what it had forgotten. Universities began to appear, first in Bologna, then Paris, then Oxford. Students studied Aristotle through Arabic lenses. Medicine rediscovered Galen through Avicenna's commentaries, and soon the question began to shift from what have we inherited to what have we lost. And still, even now, the full answer remains unclear. For every text recovered, there are dozens still missing. Books referenced by Cicero that no longer exist. Diagrams described by Vitruvius that no longer match any surviving image. Whole medical treatises, astronomical charts, engineering blueprints, all gone. Or maybe not. Maybe some survive in remote monasteries, mislabeled, misfiled, unread. Maybe a palimpsest lies under a layer of hymnals, waiting for multispectral imaging to bring it back to life. Maybe the answer to questions we haven't yet asked sits, faded, beneath the margin notes of a 9th century monk who didn't know what he was holding. And that's the quiet tragedy of the libraries that vanished. Not fire, not war, but choices. Who decided what was worth saving, and what, without ever being burned, would vanish from memory anyway? When you open a medieval manuscript, you're not always reading what it seems. Sometimes, beneath the surface text, the one copied in careful ink by a monk or scribe, there's another story, a fainter one, faded, scraped away, but still clinging to the fibers of parchment. Like a ghost, this hidden text is called a palimpsest. The word comes from Greek, palin again, and sao to scrape, because parchment was expensive, made from treated animal skin. Scribes often recycled older manuscripts by scraping off the original writing and copying a new text on top. But ink seeps deep. It doesn't always leave cleanly. Centuries later, with the help of ultraviolet light and now multispectral imaging, we've begun to uncover what lies beneath. Sometimes it's poetry. Sometimes it's mathematics. Occasionally, it's the only surviving fragment of a once vibrant work, erased, not to destroy it, but simply to make space for something more immediately useful. Imagine a monk in the year 940. He sits in a scriptorium, surrounded by bundles of unused parchment. But some of them carry faint traces of older writing, Greek symbols, diagrams, strange words. He doesn't read Greek. Few in his monastery do. Hey, and the text doesn't concern Christian teaching, so he takes a knife and scrapes the surface. He applies fresh gesso. He writes a homily over it, a sermon from a local bishop, or a tract on sin and redemption. He does not think of himself as a censor. He's not burning the past. He is preparing a page for salvation, but the past is still there. Take the Archimedes palimpsest. For centuries, it sat unnoticed in a Greek Orthodox monastery in Jerusalem. In 1229, a scribe had overwritten it with the Byzantine prayer book. But beneath the prayers, hidden in faint ink and forgotten Greek, were the lost works of Archimedes, the great mathematician of Syracuse. Not just his known treatises, but texts previously believed to be lost forever, including the method of mechanical theorems, where Archimedes explores the idea of infinitesimals, a precursor to calculus. The manuscript was sold at auction in the 1990s, and through painstaking imaging, scholars brought the original Archimedean text back to light, a miracle of survival. In near loss, rescued by accident. It wasn't the only one in St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, one of the oldest continuously operating Christian monasteries in the world. Scholars discovered dozens of palimpsests beneath the surface, buried under Syriac and Arabic Christian texts, were lost writings in Caucasian, Albanian, early Greek, Christian Palestinian, Aramaic. Some had not been read in over 1,000 years. Each palimpsest is a time capsule, not just of words, but of priorities. Each layer reveals what one generation valued and what it deemed obsolete. But not all erasures required scraping. Some were silent, gradual, a matter of neglect. In the 16th century, a Swiss physician and alchemist, Paracelsus, lamented that many ancient remedies had vanished because they were never written down at all, only spoken, and thus lost in the mouths of the dead. He wasn't wrong. Entire systems of healing, folk recipes, local plant knowledge, rural diagnostic techniques survived for generations orally, passed from one midwife to another, from healer to apprentice. But because they weren't formal, because they weren't copied by monks or discussed in courtly circles, they left no record. And so, when villages emptied during the plague, or when inquisitions silenced witches, or when communities were displaced by conquest, that knowledge simply vanished. Not burned, not banned, just forgotten. There are ghost libraries that were never built, scrolls that never made it to parchment, and even the ones that did often found no path forward. In 2015, archaeologists in Cologne, Germany, unearthed the remains of a Roman-era library, likely dating to the 2nd century CE. The building had deep niches carved into its walls, perfectly sized for scrolls. It could have held thousands, but the scrolls are gone. Gone like the papyrus of Herculaneum. Carbonized by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, in a villa believed to have belonged to the family of Julius Caesar's father-in-law. Over 1,800 scrolls were discovered, burned black and coiled shut by heat. For decades they were unreadable. Some cracked when opened, others disintegrated. But in recent years, scientists have used X-ray phase contrast tomography, a kind of 3D imaging, to virtually unroll the scrolls without touching them. Bit by bit, they are deciphering letters trapped inside charred tubes. Again, we see a truth repeated. The past is not always gone. Sometimes it's waiting in the folds of soot, in the bones of parchment, in the ink that refused to vanish. But even when a text survives, the question remains, who can read it? Language changes, alphabets evolve, scripts die in the ruins of ancient Ugarit, a city on the Syrian coast. Colleges found clay tablets inscribed in a forgotten script. It took years to decode. Now, we know they include hymns, legal codes, medical texts, but for centuries, they were just strange marks in dried mud. In the 19th century, German scholar Georg Grotefend cracked the early stages of deciphering old Persian cuneiform. His work opened the doors to reading inscriptions from the Achaemenid Empire and understanding the legacy of Darius and Xerxes. Before that, the carvings were mute, like stone with no meaning. Even today, there are scripts we cannot read, like the Rongo glyphs of Easter Island, or the Indus Valley script, a system of signs used by one of the world's oldest urban civilizations, still undeciphered. Sometimes the library vanishes, not in fire, but in code. But let's come back to Europe. Let's return to the quiet hours of the 13th century. A university scribe in Paris is copying Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, freshly retranslated from Arabic into Latin. He writes carefully. The margins carry glosses from Averroes, a Muslim commentator who shaped the way Europe would understand Aristotle. This manuscript travels, keyed, recopied, argued over. But just 2 centuries later, during the Reformation, religious tensions mount. Some institutions purge foreign influences. Manuscripts deemed heretical are locked away. Some vanish, and the cycle repeats. One era preserves, the next forgets. In the chaos of the French Revolution, thousands of medieval manuscripts were removed from monasteries. Some went to national libraries. Others were lost, stolen, or sold to private collectors who didn't always know what they had. It is estimated that more than 90% of ancient literature is lost, not because it was hated, right, but because it was fragile, and because each generation unconsciously builds its own filter. What is worth copying? What is worth translating? What is worth keeping? Sometimes the answer depends on utility, sometimes on belief, sometimes on chance. A scribe has bad eyesight and skips a page. A fire spares one monastery but burns another. A conqueror appreciates poetry but not science. A single text, like Vitruvius' De Architectura, survives because a 15th century architect finds a copy and uses it to inspire Renaissance design. But another, perhaps equally brilliant, sits unread in a private drawer. Significance unrecognized. We imagine history as a straight line, a march of knowledge from past to present. But it's more like a field of broken statues, some unearthed, others buried, many still sleeping under dust. In the libraries that vanished, they never really left. They are scattered in fragments, in Ashdod, in Palimpses, in whispering ink beneath the prayers of monks. And now, with every recovered manuscript, every digitized scroll, every spectral analysis of burned text, we rebuild a mosaic, not the full picture, but more than we had before, enough to remind us that forgetting is not always final, and sometimes, even in silence, knowledge waits. It's early morning in a small English priory. The year is 1347. The frost still clings to the stone windowsills, and the garden walls are white with rime. Somewhere inside, a bell begins to toll, low, heavy, deliberate. It rings not for the hour, but for the prayer, because in this world, time isn't measured in minutes. It's measured in devotion. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. These are the hours, the rhythm of monastic life. Not 12 evenly spaced divisions, not 60 ticked minutes per hour, but pockets of sacred attention divided by the sun's path and the needs of the soul. The clock, as you know it, is not yet fully arrived. The monk doesn't check his wrist. He doesn't glance at a dial. Instead, he listens to the tone of the bell, the direction of the wind, the softness of dawn. Time lives in the body. It lives in light. And yet, even here, even in this quiet space of prayers and psalms, change is coming. It arrives first in places that value coordination, cities with markets, towns with walls, and especially monasteries with large liturgical needs. And so the earliest mechanical clocks appear in cathedrals, attached not to wrists or pockets, but to bell towers. Their purpose is not to tell individual time, but to ring, COMMUNALLY, talk, to remind, to regulate prayer. The word clock itself comes from the Latin clocca, meaning bell, not dial, not hand. Bell. Imagine the Salisbury Cathedral clock, built around 1386. It has no face, no numbers, no hands. Strikes the hours with hammers and gears, all concealed in a wooden frame of iron. It is massive, imprecise, mesmerizing. To those who had lived by stars and shadows, the clock was not just a machine. It was a statement, a promise that time could be carved into order. But it was never quite that simple. In Islamic lands, centuries earlier, scholars had already been building timekeeping devices, astrolabes, water clocks, and complex astronomical instruments, not just for prayer, but for navigation, medicine, betting the alignment of religious festivals with lunar and solar calendars. One of the most extraordinary was Al-Jazri's elephant clock, created in the 13th century. It combined Greek and Indian technology, Chinese automata, and Arabic engineering into one unified machine, a global clock, in a sense, representing multiple cultures through its design. The elephant carried the clock mechanism in its belly. A rising float controlled how often a figure emerged from a window, striking a symbol. A dragon moved, a phoenix rotated, a mahout raised his mallet. It was time made visible through spectacle, not just for utility, but for wonder. Time wasn't just about knowing when to start a meeting. It was about storytelling, about anchoring yourself in the cosmos. But back in Europe, the practical needs of commerce and court began to pull time into a tighter grid. By the 15th century, clocks had spread to town halls and marketplaces, then to universities, then to homes, each with its own style, its own maker, its own ticking heart. But none quite agreed on what time was, because even as clocks grew more precise, local time still ruled. Noon in Paris was not noon in Avignon. Each town set its clocks by the sun, the local zenith, meaning that when it was noon in one place, it might be 12:14 in the next village. Nobody minded. Trains did not yet exist. Instant messaging was unheard of. Time remained elastic. The real turning point came in the 19th century with the railway. Imagine the chaos. A train is scheduled to leave London at 2 p.m. and arrive in Bristol at 4:17 p.m. But 2 p.m. in London isn't the same as 2 p.m. in Bristol. Schedules conflict. Sit-ins happen. And so, in 1847, British rail companies adopt Greenwich Mean Time across all stations, standardizing time regardless of local solar position. The clocks lie gently, deliberately. They no longer reflect the sky. They reflect the system. The public resists. Some towns refuse to adjust their clocks. Church towers ring at true noon, while train stations quietly run on GMT. Pocket watches sometimes have two hands, one for local time, one for railway time. Eventually, resistance fades. Accuracy wins in 1884. The International Meridian Conference makes Greenwich the global reference point for longitude and timekeeping. The world is divided into 24 zones, each shift by 1 hour. It feels normal to you now. But imagine how radical it was to tell a farmer in Minnesota that he must plant his field not by the sun, but by a clock set in England, to tell an entire planet to agree on a fiction. Time zones weren't the only artificial construct. The calendar itself, which seems so fixed, so natural, is a patchwork of reforms and compromises. The Romans began with a lunar calendar. It drifted badly, so Julius Caesar, with the help of Egyptian astronomers, produced the Julian calendar in 46 BCE, a solar-based system with leap years and 12 fixed months, but it was still slightly off by 11 minutes per year. After 1,600 years, that era had accumulated into weeks. The spring equinox had drifted. Easter was falling too early, so Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1508. 10 days were skipped overnight. October 4th was followed by October 15th. People were confused. Some believed they had lost part of their lives. Others protested, thinking it was a plot. Not all countries adopted it at once. Protestant lands delayed. Orthodox regions waited centuries. Russia didn't convert until 1918. Greece followed in 1923. For a time, correspondence between nations had to list two dates, Old Style and New Style. Even today, we inherit remnants of these changes. Ever wonder why September, October, November, and December, names that mean 7, 8, 9, and 10, are actually months? 9, 10, 11, and 12. Because the year once began in March. A silent shift, a forgotten starting line. But not all cultures followed the Gregorian order. The Hebrew calendar is lunar solar, but leap months. The Islamic calendar is purely lunar, causing holidays like Ramadan to shift across the solar year. The Chinese calendar combines lunar cycles with solar terms, creating a 60-year cycle used for everything from zodiac years to traditional medicine. Time, turns out, is not a singular thread. It is a braid, woven from astronomy, theology, agriculture, and memory. And occasionally, it frays. Consider leap seconds, tiny adjustments added to keep atomic time in sync with Earth's rotation. Since 1972, we've added over 24. Of them, they don't occur regularly. They confuse software. Particularly controversial. In 2012, a leap second caused computer glitches across major websites. In 2015, another disrupted stock trading. Some scientists want to abolish them. Others worry about the symbolism. That we might stop caring if our clocks no longer match the planet. But perhaps the most haunting chapter of all comes not from misalignment, but from erasure. During the French Revolution, radicals introduced a republican calendar. They divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each. Each month had 3 10-day weeks called decades. The remaining 5 or 6 days were national holidays. The clock was reformed to 10 hours per day, 100 minutes per hour, 100 seconds per minute. It was elegant, decimal, rational, and nobody liked it. Workers hated the longer week. Priests mocked the removal of Sundays. The decimal hours never caught on. By 1805, the calendar was abandoned. The old system returned, but the idea that time itself could be redesigned remained in the air. Even now, we speak of daylight, saving time, of adding or subtracting hours like coins in a purse. We bend time to fit schedules, shift clocks to match mood, celebrate New Year's in waves from Auckland to Honolulu, watching fireworks in time zones we'll never visit. Yet, somewhere beneath it all, the old rhythms persist. The sun still rises at its own pace. The body still follows its circadian drum. The monk in the priory, centuries ago, knew something that we often forget. Time is not just something we keep, it's something we feel. And when we stopped listening, when we traded bells for alarms, shadows for screens, we gained precision, but we lost something else, a kind of silence, a kind of breath between hours. Let us drift away from the ringing bells and smoky priory kitchens now. The year has shifted forward a little. It is still long before the modern world, and yet there is a quiet room somewhere, square, stone, and windowed on one side, where time doesn't quite follow the outside world. This is not a library of books, not in a sense, you know. This is a library of time, and its shelves are not made of oak or iron. They are made of silence, of dust, of footsteps too soft to echo. You are inside the scriptorium. It is late morning maybe, but no one glances outside to check. The world runs differently here. A monk or a scholar, hooded, hunched, scratches patiently at a stretched animal skin. His pen is a quill. His ink is ground from soot and ash. The candle beside him gutters slightly. Though the sun has already risen, he is copying, not writing something new, not inventing or theorizing, but copying. The book in front of him is old. The one he is creating will become new, but both contain the same knowledge, the same rhythm of thought. A liturgical calendar, a medical treatise, a preserved translation of Galen or Aristotle or Isidore. This is how time is held, not in minutes or clocks, yet in manuscripts. If the clock was a way to measure time's passing, then the scriptorium was a way to defy it, to bind time into a parchment, to slow it, preserve it, replay it. Monasteries were some of the first institutions to maintain time, not just through bells, but through texts. They cataloged not only prayers and psalms, but calendars, astronomy, seasonal cycles, and records of eclipses and tides. In the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, for instance, a plan was once drafted, a great architectural drawing showing the ideal monastery layout. It included stables, an infirmary, gardens, a mill, and a library. Always a library that the scriptorium might have only a few shelves. But what sat on them was not merely paper. It was memory of saints and sinners, of failed harvests and lean years, of the days when the bells rang early or didn't ring at all. The monks didn't just copy words, they copied time itself. But this work was fragile, vulnerable, because fire loved parchment and war ignored silence. One careless ember could erase centuries. One conquering army could scatter names like leaves. In 1356, the town of Basel caught fire. Dozens of monastic manuscripts were destroyed. Some were copies of ancient Roman works that no longer exist in any other form. In 1421, the Turks set fire to the great library of Constantinople. Flames fed on scrolls brought from Egypt and Syria, the breath of other centuries, over and over. The libraries of time returned to Ashdod, and yet something strange persisted. The monks kept copying, even when they knew the war was coming, even when they feared the pages might never be read, because they were not copying for now. They were copying for after, for some reader who might not yet be born, who might need the old ways, who might hear the ticking beneath the silence. And sometimes they made mistakes. A scribe in the 11th century might misread a Greek word. A 13th century monk might alter a sentence to make it fit the current theology. Not deliberately, not to deceive, but to survive. Because even the act of copying was a kind of interpretation, and interpretation is shaped by its hour. Thus, time crept into the margins, into the glosses and notations, into the hesitation of a phrase. Every book became a time capsule, not just of its subject, but of its copier. You can see it in the ink color, in the way the letter S curves, in the angle of the spine binding. You can read the pressure of a tired hand, the interruption of a feast day, the smudge of a winter breath caught on cold vellum. The manuscript is not just about knowledge, it is about presence, and presence takes time. Even today, when we digitize old works, scan them, and tag them, we sometimes forget that these books are not merely texts, they are echoes. One manuscript might have taken 10 years to create, 10 years to craft. One copy. Imagine waiting a decade for a single book, not because it's rare, but because time itself must be poured into its making. Now, compare that to how time is treated today. A book can be printed by the tens of thousands in a single night. A document can be copied and pasted in seconds. A library can fit on a thumb drive smaller than a matchbox, and yet something is missing. The weight of time, the slowness, reverence for the page. You don't need to become a monk to feel it. Just sit in an old library one day, one with stone steps and dim bulbs, if you can. Notice how your footsteps slow, how your voice quiets, okay? How your body senses that it has entered a room where time is different, where minutes stretch, where clocks hesitate. This is not nostalgia. It is rhythm. The same rhythm that once guided the scriptorium. The same rhythm that told the bell when to ring, the hand when to turn the page. That rhythm still lives. Sometimes in an old book's crackling spine, sometimes in your own breath, and sometimes in a silence so deep it can only be measured by the sound of a pen scratching. The ink had not yet dried on the final manuscript when the door opened. This was the early 15th century in a small cloistered abbey near Worcester, and the final page of a Latin treatise on medicinal herbs was being pressed and cooled. The monk, weary, his fingers blackened with soot and linseed oil, glanced up. A young messenger stood in the doorway, drenched in fog, bearing news from the bishop. There was to be no more copying for now. Kay's resources were needed elsewhere. The wool trade was faltering. Kay, the region, faced famine. And somewhere across the sea, a new invention was beginning to flicker like a far-off candle. It was the beginning of the end for the scriptorium. Not with fire, not with conquest, but with silence. Because books were about to change shape. And with them, so would time. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century is one of those familiar stories we learn as school children. Johannes Gutenberg, around 1440, developed a system of movable metal type, allowing for the fast and affordable production of books. Before that, each book was copied by hand, word for word, line for line, by scribes, monks, and scholars. It was a slow process. It required months or years to create a single copy. A mistake meant scraping the ink off carefully or starting over, but the printing press would reduce that labor 2 hours. A single operator with movable letters and a screw press could churn out multiple copies in a week, eventually thousands. It democratized information. It revolutionized Europe. It killed the monastic library, not all at once, not dramatically, but like the whispering hush that falls over a hall after the music stops. In the decades following Gutenberg's invention, manuscript production slowed. By 1500, tens of thousands of printed works had been produced. Cities like Venice and Mainz exploded with presses and printers. Trade networks spread paper, ink, and typefaces faster than any monastic caravan ever could. At first, it seemed like a blessing. The old texts, Plato, Galen, Boethius, could now be copied and sent to scholars across Europe. Errors in older manuscripts could be corrected. Knowledge could spread faster than ever. But something disappeared along the way, because each printed book was the same, identical type. Identical spacing, identical binding. Gone were the fingerprints of the scribe, the glosses in the margin, the local annotations, the trembling line where a monk paused to sneeze in winter. In becoming efficient, books became uniform, and uniformity has a price. No longer could historians trace the travels of a text by its handwriting. No longer could you tell, from a faded letter or cracked spine, how many winters a book had survived. No longer did a book feel like a conversation with a human being across time. It felt like a transaction. It was progress, but it was also erasure. And here, in this quiet shift from pen to press, we find a strange paradox. The printing press saved books, but it buried the libraries, because monastic libraries weren't just collections of words. They were maps of memory. Each monastery's library was unique, shaped by the interests, prejudices, and accidents of its inhabitants. One abbey might have dozens of texts on farming and none on law. Another might contain rare translations of Persian science, lost to time elsewhere. And these texts were often local, created by and for the community they served. written in the vernacular, annotated with regional details, whispering in their own way the names of forgotten rivers, hills, herbs, and illnesses. When the presses began rolling, they rolled out centralized knowledge, standardized, approved, and in doing so, they drowned out the quieter voices of the local libraries. At the 17th century, many monastic libraries were gone. Some were dissolved, deliberately, like during the English Reformation under Henry VIII, when monastic lands were seized and libraries pillaged. Ancient books were burned, sold, used as kindling, or repurposed as bookbinding for newer Protestant texts. Others simply fell into disuse. A leaky roof, a cracked wall, a failed harvest. And slowly, the shelves warped, the pages mildew, and silence returned. Not the reverent silence of study, but the hollow kind that follows abandonment. And yet, something lingered. Even after the presses, even after the closures, some of those old libraries resisted death. A monk in a forgotten convent in Portugal might still transcribe a hymn by hand. A nun in a cold German abbey might keep a personal codex, updating the births and deaths of her village. In a quiet back room of a Spanish monastery, a scholar might stumble on a pre-Christian recipe hidden in the margin of a forgotten herbal text. These weren't libraries in the grand sense. They were residues, traces of a slower rhythm, a different time, and occasionally they saved what printing had missed. One of the most remarkable examples lies in the story of the Codex Amiatinus, a massive Latin Bible made in 8th century Northumbria, weighing over 75 pounds, was a gift for the Pope that never quite made it to its destination and sat, largely, forgotten in Italy for centuries. When later scholars sought to recover the most accurate version of the Latin Vulgate Bible, it wasn't a printed edition they trusted most. It was this, a hand-copied book created over 1,000 years prior, with the dedication and time of an entire monastic community. Because not all printing preserves truth, and not all slowness is inefficiency. In some cases, it's the only way to remember. Let us pause here. Imagine you are in a modern library. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, digital catalogs, and in one dim corner, an old manuscript lies behind glass. You can't touch it. You can't even breathe on it. But you see it. Its pages are uneven. Its ink is fading. Its margins are filled with strange symbols and slanted notes. Doesn't look efficient, but it looks alive. You can almost hear the bell in the distance. Smell the wax. Feel the cold stone beneath your feet. This was once a living book, not a product, but a promise. A promise that even when the world forgot how to listen, someone would still write it down. Someone would still keep time with ink. Someone would still believe that a single sentence, carefully preserved, could outlive a century. And maybe it did. It did. It is sometime around the year 476. The sun sets early over a countryside that no longer belongs to an empire. The great imperial machine has ground to a halt. The roads that once pulsed with the sound of marching legions and the creak of merchant carts have gone quiet. The statues still stand, but vines curl up their stone ankles. Public baths are empty. Libraries are dark. And somewhere, in a crumbling villa, a Roman noble stares out a shattered window and wonders where everyone went. This is how we often imagine the fall of Rome. Sudden, total, like a light being switched off across the Western world. We picture armored barbarians rushing through the gates, setting fire to scrolls, smashing aqueducts, and dragging civilization backward by centuries. And then, darkness, the Dark Ages. But was it really that dark? Oh, is the darkness more about what we don't know than what actually happened? The term Dark Ages has a long, complicated history. It was first popularized by Renaissance thinkers, especially Petrarch in the 14th century, who looked back on the centuries after Rome's fall as a cultural and intellectual void. According to them, the light of classical knowledge had gone out and Europe had wandered blindly until it was reignited by the likes of Leonardo, Galileo, and Erasmus. The metaphor was powerful and is stuck. But there's a strange irony in how the Dark Ages got their name. It wasn't the people of the time who called it that. It was later historians. They looked back, saw a period with fewer written records, fewer monumental buildings, and fewer well-known names, and assumed that meant nothing was happening. But something always happens. The problem was, not everyone had been writing it down. When Rome fell, or rather, when the Western Roman Empire dissolved into a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, the people didn't vanish. They didn't stop living or farming or trading or raising children. They simply adapted. And much of that adaptation happened quietly, without fanfare, and without ink. This silence, this lack of written records, is part of what fuels the perception of darkness. Consider this. In the Roman world, literacy rates were relatively high, at least among the elite, and there were scribes, archives, and correspondence flowing across the empire. But after the empire's collapse in the West, much of that infrastructure disintegrated. Writing didn't cease entirely, but it slowed, and it shifted from cities and public forums to monasteries and isolated centers of religious life. This meant that the kinds of stories being recorded changed too. Fewer tax rolls, fewer legal proceedings, fewer philosophical debates. Instead, we get hagiographies, stories of saints and martyrs, miracles, translations of scriptures, religious commentaries. These are invaluable in their own right, but they offer a skewed portrait of society, a quieter one, less secular, more spiritual. And for modern historians trying to reconstruct the everyday life of early medieval Europe, they offer more gaps than guidance. So what filled the silence? For many years, the story of the Dark Ages was one of decline. Decline in trade, decline in art, decline in population. The Quine Carrier and Arles shrank. Aquia, roads, decayed. Pottery became simpler. Buildings were made with wood instead of stone. It looked, to later observers, like the world had regressed. But that story is being rewritten. Archaeology, in particular, has chipped away at the myth of a lifeless Europe. Please, once thought deserted, we now find evidence of bustling communities, just smaller, more rural, and more self-sufficient than before. In England, post-Roman settlements grew up near abandoned villas, repurposing stonework and maintaining local agriculture. In Gaul, trade continued along rivers and coastlines, even if it no longer followed the same grand Roman networks. And in the Byzantine East, what remained of the Roman Empire, cities like Constantinople, thrived, preserving libraries, technologies, and court systems well into the Middle Ages. Even in the so-called darkest corners of Europe, learning didn't entirely disappear. Take the Isle of Iona, off the coast of Scotland. In the 6th century, a group of Irish monks settled there, led by St. Columba. From this small, windswept island, they copied manuscripts, preserved fragments of classical learning, and spread Christianity across the Scottish Highlands. Their work, though humble, kept a flickering flame of literacy alive. Or look to Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, where, by the 10th century, the city of Cordoba had streetlights, libraries, and medical schools. At a time when much of Northern Europe was still largely agrarian, while Christian Europe struggled to rebuild its intellectual traditions. Muslim scholars were translating Aristotle, developing algebra, and mapping the stars. So again, darkness was not everywhere, but it's easy to call a period dark if you're standing in a brightly lit room, looking backward. And this leads us to a strange question. Did the Dark Ages ever really happen? Or did we simply stop listening? The problem, of course, is that history isn't always recorded by the people who lived it. It's recorded by the people who had the means, the pen, the parchment, the time, the education. And for a few hundred years after Rome's collapse, many of those tools were concentrated in religious communities, priorities were spiritual rather than civic. That doesn't mean the rest of life disappeared. It just means it went unwritten. So we return to the image of the Roman noble, staring from his window at a changing world. Maybe he didn't see chaos. Maybe he saw adaptation. The blacksmith now mended plows, not swords. The bathhouse became a barn. The amphitheater filled with weeds and sheep. Life didn't end. It shifted, and yet some things were lost. Some texts did vanish permanently. Some skills did atrophy, and in places where famine, war, or plague struck hard, communities truly did regress. The 6th century Justinian plague, for example, killed millions and may have accelerated the fragmentation of post-Roman life. The Little Ice Age brought crop failures, invasions by Vikings, Magyars, canned Saracens destabilized what little order had been rebuilt. So perhaps the darkness wasn't total, but it wasn't imaginary either. It was a patchwork of shadows. Some areas dimmed, others flickered, a few burned brightly, and over time those small flames in monasteries, cities, and distant caliphates began to grow. By the 11th century, Europe was experiencing a slow but steady revival in population, trade, learning, and technology. The light didn't return all at once. It crept back in, line by line, brick by brick, book by book. But before we call it a comeback, we have to ask, did it ever really leave? Or did we just forget how to look? We tend to think of knowledge as a steady climbing, upward staircase of learning, technology, literacy, and achievement. But when you stand at the edge of what used to be the Roman world and look out at the centuries that followed, you don't see a straight line. You see something more jagged, a series of broken steps, sometimes moving forward, sometimes falling back, sometimes pausing in stillness. The centuries after Rome's collapse in the West, roughly 500 to 1000, were filled with these pauses. But it wasn't because the people forgot how to build or to write or to think. It was because the systems that supported those things shifted, and where once ideas had flowed freely across the empire's roads and sea lanes, now those currents were disrupted. Yet the knowledge didn't vanish. It simply moved, and it often found refuge in places that the historians of later centuries overlooked. Let's begin in the libraries, or rather, in the scriptorial rooms in monasteries where monks worked quietly and slowly, day after day, copying books by hand. Not just Christian texts, but classical ones too. Works of Cicero, Virgil, Boethius, and Aristotle, even practical manuals on medicine, agriculture, astronomy, taught the Irish monks were particularly devoted to this work. In the early medieval period, Ireland was largely untouched by the chaos that swept mainland Europe. Its relative isolation became an unexpected asset. Monasteries like Clonmacnoise and Glendellow became intellectual havens, while the island's people were known to the Romans only faintly. Their monks would eventually travel across the continent, reintroducing forgotten works to the rest of Europe. Take the story of Alcuin of York, for example, an Anglo-Saxon scholar from what is now northern England. Alcuin studied in cathedral schools and monasteries and eventually came to the attention of Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish king who sought to rebuild a new Western Roman Empire in the 8th century. Charlemagne wasn't a particularly literate man himself, but he understood the power of learning. So he gathered scholars from across his empire, including Alcuin, to teach, organize libraries, and train scribes. Under their guidance, the Carolingian Renaissance took shape. The script was standardized, grammar was formalized, books were copied and shared in increasing numbers. Education, once limited to monks and bishops, began to expand slowly to aristocrats, clerks, and other elites. This was no grand rebirth. It didn't touch the majority of peasants, who remained illiterate, but it was enough to push a few steps forward again. enough to preserve the fragile flicker of classical learning. It's tempting to think of medieval Europe as a land cut off from the rest of the world, inert, but that too is a misunderstanding. Trade never ceased entirely, simply rooted. While the great Roman roads crumbled, new maritime and overland trade routes emerged, connecting Scandinavia to the Baltic, the British Isles to the Frankish kingdoms, in Europe to the Islamic world through the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean. And it was Islamic scholars who became some of the most crucial preservers, enhancers of classical knowledge in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba. The works of ancient Greece and Rome were not just copied, but studied, commented on, and expanded. Philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes engaged with Aristotle and Plato, blending their ideas with Islamic theology, medicine, and science. Mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra. Astronomers mapped the heavens with increasing precision. Medical treatises circulated widely. And crucially, this knowledge did not remain locked away in Arabic. It made its way back to Europe first in small trickles, then in greater waves through places like Sicily, Venice, and Toledo, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, translating texts into Latin, so even as Europe seemed to sleep, its neighbors were wide awake, and some parts of Europe were wide awake too. Let's take a walk into the Byzantine Empire. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, the Eastern Empire carried uncensored in Constantinople till 1453. That's nearly 1,000 more years of imperial administration, city building, diplomacy, and learning. In Constantinople, classical texts were still taught in schools. Architects continued to build monumental structures like the Hagia Sophia. Diplomats negotiated with the Islamic world, the Slavs, the Bulgars, and the Franks. Bureaucrats maintained tax systems and trade policies. Artists refined mosaics and religious iconography. Scholars debated theology, philosophy, and law. This was not a dark age, it was a transformation, and beyond Byzantium, we find more quiet transformations in the far north. Vikings, so often painted as barbaric raiders, were also traders, settlers, and builders. As they moved through the British Isles, the Frankish coast, and even the rivers of Rus, modern-day Russia and Ukraine, they brought with them not only destruction, but also cultural exchange. In Iceland, for instance, the Vikings created one of the most literate medieval societies, preserving their laws and sagas in written form by the 12th century. These texts, like the poetic Edda and the saga of the Greenlanders, are not only rich in mythology, but provide critical insights into Norse law, travel, and daily life. Meanwhile, in the heart of Europe, agriculture was being revolutionized. The heavy plow was introduced, which allowed farmers to till the tough clay soils of northern Europe more effectively. The use of horse collars and three-field crop rotation increased yields. Population slowly began to grow. Villages expanded. Trade revived. This, too, is often overlooked in traditional histories. It's not dramatic. It's not illuminated by war or crowned by cathedrals. But the ability to grow more food reliably meant more people could survive. More children could be raised. More surplus could be traded. And more time could be devoted to craft, learning, and innovation. That's not darkness. That's resilience. So, why does the myth of the Dark Ages persist? Part of it is cultural bias. The people who defined the Renaissance were often eager to see themselves as the rediscoverers of lost wisdom, and to elevate themselves, they needed something to contrast with. The centuries before them became the shadow, the silence, the gloom. But history is not a morality tale. It doesn't obey the rhythms of drama. Most of human existence is lived in the margins, in the slow days between wars and kings, And it is in those margins that people keep the world moving. A monk copying a manuscript by candlelight, a peasant experimenting with crop spacing, a midwife remembering an herbal remedy passed down from her grandmother, a merchant learning a new dialect to trade across a river, a teacher instructing one more child how to read. These are not grand events, but they are the fibers of continuity, and in them the supposed darkness becomes less convincing. Still, there is a question that lingers. If the knowledge never vanished, it merely shifted or traveled or hid in quiet corners then. Why did it take so long for it to return to prominence in Europe? Why the centuries of stagnation? Was it fear, loss of confidence, or was it simply the long, slow work of rebuilding networks, communities, and institutions? One scriptorium, one monastery, one village at a time. And what does that say about the fragility of knowledge? Asterisk, that it can survive only if someone bothers to carry it. Let's walk through a street that doesn't exist anymore. A Roman street. Not the grand marble forum of a senator's palace, but a more ordinary lane in a provincial town, maybe in Gaul or Britannia. Stone underfoot, gutters built to manage. Rain, a line of shops open to the air, their wooden shutters lifted like awnings. There's a bakery with its familiar burnt smell, smithy with a clang of iron, echoing against stone walls, and a thermopolium, the Roman version of a fast food shop selling hot porridge or lentils or stew. On this street, everyone speaks a kind of Latin, not Cicero's eloquent Latin, but a rougher version, accented and peppered with regional slang. A baker's apprentice might be able to read a menu scratched into wood. A town clerk could draft a tax note. A shopkeeper might write a bill of sale. It's not universal literacy, but it's common enough to keep the gears turning. There are schools, there are ledgers, there are bureaucrats. Now, fast forward 3 centuries, the road is cracked, the shop fronts are gone. The buildings still stand, mostly, though many are scavenged for stone. The town is smaller now, perhaps only a village. The public bathhouse is filled in with dirt and weeds. The old granary is now a chapel. Latin is still spoken, but its change fragmented into regional dialects that will someday become French or Spanish or Italian. Few people here can read anymore. A local priest might know his scripture by memory, even if he can't write it all down. The baker no longer keeps ledgers. He trades loaves for wool or eggs or favors. The world has not ended, but it has grown narrower. So what was lost? It wasn't just knowledge, It was a way of organizing the world. The Roman Empire had engineers who understood the gradient of aqueducts, the load-bearing strength of arches, and the schedule of public works. It had lawyers who could quote centuries of legal precedent and draft charters for land and title. It had tax officials who maintained ledgers across continents. It had physicians, mapmakers, architects, poets, and philosophers. A system that allowed all of them to correspond, to move, to be summoned from one province to another. When that system collapsed in the West, it wasn't just buildings that fell into disuse. It was the interconnectedness that crumbled. A world where you could send a letter from Londinium to Carthage and expect a reply within months. This became a world where nearby forests might as well have been another planet. We sometimes imagine medieval people as disinterested in knowledge, but the opposite was true. They were surrounded by a past they did not understand, and that provoked deep curiosity and even fear. Ruins were everywhere. Roman bridges still stood over rivers, sometimes the only passable route for miles. Temples half buried in vines littered countryside hills. Stone roads disappeared into forests and came out again in places no one remembered. The skeleton of the past remained, but the instructions had been lost. Medieval chroniclers tried to make sense of these relics. Some believed the ancient ruins were built by giants. Others attributed them to lost magical races. A few thought They were the remnants of a time when men had been more righteous or closer to God. In this absence of explanation, myth filled the gaps, but not always. There were those who tried to rebuild the path back, and many of them were not emperors or kings, but monks, craftsmen, and wanderers. Let's take the humble example of a mill. Roman mills were impressive. They used water power efficiently and often ran multiple millstones with a complex series of gears. But in many parts of Europe, especially north of the Alps, this knowledge was not preserved. Mills had to be invented by the 9th century. Watermills will once again becoming common not because someone found an ancient Roman manual, but because medieval craftsmen figured it out again, sometimes in new ways. Windmills appeared later, and in time, these devices became more efficient than their Roman predecessors. Or look at architecture. The Romans had concrete. The secret of their hydraulic lime was lost for centuries. Medieval builders didn't recover the exact formula, but they developed their own methods. Flying buttresses, vaulted ceilings, and ribbed arches weren't revivals of Roman technique. They were innovations born from necessity, built to support stone roofs in towering cathedrals that reached toward heaven. Much of what the medieval world created wasn't a return to the old, but a reinvention. Still, the absence of formal institutions meant that many individual discoveries were not shared widely. Inventions were local. Clever smith in one village might create a new plow design, but it wouldn't spread until merchants or nobles took notice. There was no patent system, no national academy, no scientific journal, and this is perhaps the greatest difference between the classical and medieval worlds: the speed of transmission. Ideas did not travel fast, which meant that rediscovery had to happen again and again, scattered places, at irregular intervals. It was a world of small epiphanies, not sudden renaissances. Now, let's return to that Roman street. It's 500 years later. The village has grown again. The old Roman well still provides water, but now it's part of the churchyard. A new road, muddy and rutted, passes by where the forum used to be. There's a school nearby, run by a priest. His students are boys from noble families, learning to read Latin not for commerce or engineering, but to understand scripture and chant. Nearby, a woman brews beer in a large wooden tub. She doesn't know the chemical reasons fermentation works, but her family has done this for generations, and it provides clean drink in a world where rivers are fouled. In another cottage, a blacksmith teaches his son how to temper iron. The boy doesn't know the word metallurgy, but he understands the color of the flame, the sound of the hammer, the curve of the blade. This isn't a dark age, a different age, an age of oral memory instead of written manuals, an age where knowledge is transmitted through repetition, not texts, an age where 1,000 small actions preserve the rhythm of life. What was really lost then? Confidence, perhaps. When Rome fell, the people who came after no longer believed they could do what their ancestors had done. The grandeur of Rome became mythologized, unreachable. And when you believe something is beyond you, you stop trying to reach it. That's the true weight of a dark age. Not ignorance, but disbelief in what was preserved. More than we think. Language evolved, but Latin lived in sermons, in law, in learning. Roads broke down, but trade continued by river, by sea, by foot. Books were burned or lost, but others were copied slowly, carefully, by hands stained with ink and wax. Faith was fragmented, but devotion remained in the end. The so-called Dark Ages were not a void. They were a passage, a long, dim hallway between two kinds of light, and though the torches flickered, they never went out. So the next time you hear that history went backward, or that a whole civilization forgot how to live, pause for a moment. Ask who built the barn that fed a village, who nursed the sick in a plague-ridden abbey, who risked their life to preserve a scroll. or mend a roof, or sing an ancient song to a frightened child. The future was hidden in those people, not in grand declarations, but in their quiet refusal to let the world go dark, go dark. It is late. The sun has dipped behind the trees and the wind has settled. The village is quiet. Chimneys release soft curls of smoke into the night air, and the faint smell of burning heather lingers on the breeze. Inside a cottage near the edge of the woods, a woman places her hand on the belly of another woman, young, sweating, her face drawn tight in pain. Labor has begun, and the only one who knows what to do is the older woman, the midwife. She doesn't wear robes. There's no certificate on the wall, but her hands are steady. Her breath is slow. Her mind full of memories. This is the kind of knowledge that can't be found in books, because in many places there are no books, and if there are, they are not written for women like her. She knows the signs of a good birth, the angle of the hips, the pattern of the pain. She knows how to turn the baby gently if it comes the wrong way, how to cut the cord with a shard of boiled flint, how to make a broth that will restore the mother's strength, how to bury the afterbirth far from town to keep away wolves and worse. No one taught her this in school. She learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. A line of women stretching back centuries, unbroken in this world, before hospitals, before scientific medicine, before glass thermometers or antiseptic solutions. Health and healing belong to those who remember, those who watch, those who care. And often that meant women, not because they were biologically destined for it, right? But because in the absence of formal learning, medicine became what you did with your hands and your heart. If someone was burned, you knew which herbs drew out the heat. If someone was sick with a fever, you wrapped them in wool soaked in willow bark. If a child coughed blood, you did what you could. And when you couldn't help, you sat beside them and stayed in every village. There was someone who held the thread of life in their care. And more often than not, it was a woman, a healer, a bone setter, a midwife, Mai's woman. But they weren't always honored, because the same knowledge that brought comfort also brought suspicion. If you could stop a birth from going badly, then maybe you could make one go badly on purpose. If you knew how to stop bleeding, maybe you knew how to make someone bleed. And if you could heal, maybe you could curse. This fear wasn't always spoken aloud, but it lived in the corners of conversation, whispered in alleys and by candlelight. It grew louder during bad harvests, during plagues, during storms. The healer became the suspect. The helper became the outcast. And yet, women continued to remember, because not everyone could go to a monastery to study. Not everyone could read Latin. Not everyone could afford to be a physician, licensed and approved by men who debated humors and planetary influences. In the medieval world, medicine wasn't just in universities. It was in kitchens, gardens, and dreams. And often it was passed down in the margins, quietly, carefully, in a kind of underground library made of people. Let us walk now through such a library, not made of shelves and scrolls, but of breath and voice. The first room is a cottage. There's a bundle of dried sage hanging from the ceiling, a string of dried apples, a cloth bundle tied with twined smells of lavender and something sharper, maybe vinegar soaked with garlic. An old woman is teaching her granddaughter how to mix it, not with measurements, but with memory. A pinch, a glance, a stir, she says, for the fever. And the girl remembers. The second room is a forest glade. A younger woman kneels by the roots of an elder tree, digging gently. Her mother stands behind her, naming plants. That one for wounds, this one for cough. That one, never touch. Each name is spoken twice. Once in Latin, once in the tongue of the people, because both languages matter, and both must be hidden. The third room is a firelit hut at night. A baby cries. A woman hums a tune older than the church. Her hands are stained with birth, her eyes heavy. She whispers a prayer that is neither Christian nor pagan, but something in between. She has no word for what she is. She is not a doctor, not a nun, not a witch, but she is what stands between life and death tonight, and that too is power. Sometimes this kind of knowledge brought women into conflict with the church, not always directly, but in a world where men controlled writing, laws, and theology. Women who healed with memory were a threat, especially if their memory stretched too far, especially if they remembered what others had forgotten, like the old ways of calling on saints, not listed in church registers, or the chants used before the bells rang on Easter morning, or the meanings of stars, herbs, and birthmarks. Women were not supposed to remember these things, not officially, but they did, and sometimes they paid for it during outbreaks of plague. It was often the local midwives and herbalists who were blamed, not the fleas, not the rats, not the filth, but the woman who brewed tea from dried flowers, or the one who kept a black cat, or the one who buried jars of salt under her doorway. These signs, once ordinary, became dangerous, because in times of fear, people searched for scapegoats, and women who knew too much were easy to accuse. Over time, as universities grew, medicine became professionalized, and in most of Europe, that meant male to practice lawfully. One needed a license to get a license. One needed to study. One needed to be male, wealthy, and literate. The rest were pushed to the margins. Midwifery became a tolerated exception, barely herbal. Medicine survived in isolated regions, but the memory passed from grandmother to granddaughter began to fray. And yet, not all was lost. In some places, women formed guilds of sorts, not formal unions, but webs of cooperation. One midwife might travel for a birth. Another might provide herbs for bleeding. A third might care for orphans or help prepare the dead. Together, they kept the web intact, even when the church watched, even when the law turned cold, even when time moved on and forgot their names. Today, we rarely remember these women. Their graves are unmarked, their knowledge often erased or credited to others. But they existed. They kept people alive in a world without hospitals. They remembered the recipes no one wrote down. They brewed the broths, the teas, the infusions. They stood by bedsides and said, "Breathe." And sometimes they were burned for it, not because they failed, but because they dared to succeed, and the world could not understand how they did it. But tonight, as we rest and drift, we can remember them, not as witches, not as saints, but as women who knew the sky, who knew the stars and the symptoms, who held knowledge in their hands when the world could not. And perhaps that memory, too, is a kind of medicine. You wake to the sound of wind against wood, a hollow, scraping wind that sounds like it's carrying words too quiet to hear, too ancient to understand. The village is not yet awake. The hearth is cold, but something in the air feels alive, not haunted, not dangerous, just remembered, as though the land itself is muttering a story it hasn't told in a long, long time. You follow it, and the path takes you not to the monastery, or the castle, or even the market square, but to the edge of the forest, to a low, moss-covered house that always seemed a little outside of time, the kind of house where shutters stay closed in winter and open only at dusk, the kind of place where you remember hearing women's voices but not seeing their faces. And inside, past the herbs drying from the rafters and the bundles of nettle stacked neatly by the hearth, sits a woman named Anka. She's not a name in your history books, but she lived. She healed. She knew the sky. Anka was born in the late 1200s in what is now southern Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, technically. But borders were fuzzy, and most people didn't think in terms of empires. They thought in terms of their village, a priest, their tax collector, their seasons. She grew up as the daughter of a woodsman. Poor, yes, but not isolated. In fact, women like Anka often knew more about their environment than the clergy. Passed through only once or twice a year. By her teens, she could name 70 kinds of plant by sight, knew which mushrooms you could eat and which would leave your mouth foaming, knew how to boil nettles with barley to make a tonic for early spring when food ran low and scurvy crept in, knew how to wrap a sprained ankle with linen soaked in elderflower vinegar. She was not taught. She watched, and when her mother died in childbirth, her sixth child, Ika's third sister, Anka, was the one who took over by 17. She was the village midwife by 25. She was the one they sent for when the blood wouldn't stop. By 30, they began to whisper, because knowledge is a double-edged blade, and when it rests in the hands of someone outside the accepted hierarchy, especially a woman, it begins to look suspicious. Anka, for all her usefulness, began to be treated as something other. No one ever said it directly, but the tone of the conversations shifted. People thanked her with eyes lowered. Mothers hesitated before letting their daughters go gather herbs with her. And more than once, she found strange marks carved into her door and night crosses. Slashes. Saul thought to be powerful and female in the wrong century was to live in permanent ambiguity. You were needed, but never fully trusted. You were praised, but always one breath away from accusation. And then came the fire. Not in her house, but in the town 2 miles west. A fever spread. 3 children dead. 1 priest young, frightened, and very certain of doctrine, decided that someone must be to blame. Anka had been there. After all, she'd brought dried poppy to soothe their pain, had chanted soft words as they passed. Words, she said, were prayers. Words the priest did not recognize. She was summoned, not formally, not by king or court, but by pitchfork and torch. A group of men came to her door one night. They did not knock. They did not ask. They dragged her to the chapel and demanded she explain herself. Where did you learn your craft? Why do you speak to the trees? What do your symbols mean? She tried to answer calmly. Said her mother had taught her. Said the forest was full of signs, if only one paid attention. Said the symbols were for protection, but she was a woman, and they had already decided what she was. They did not kill her, not that night, but they marked her, branded her as a heretic, forbade her from practicing. And when the next birth went badly and the child died, they blamed her anyway for not being there. Anka lived another 20 years, but no one came to her door again. She kept her herbs, whispered her prayers, taught no one, and when she died, her knowledge died with her. Multiply her story by thousands. Women like Anka were everywhere in medieval Europe. Some were tolerated, some were killed. Most were forgotten. Their names never appeared in textbooks. Their words never written down. For centuries, they were the ones who kept people alive when no one else would. And then came the Inquisition. We often imagine the Inquisition as a grand courtroom drama with inquisitors in long robes. But in many towns, it was quieter than that. It came in the form of suspicion, of lists kept by priests, of whispered reports, of questions asked again and again. Do you know anyone who talks to animals, who gathers herbs alone, who sings over boiling pots? Many of these questions were rooted in fear, not just of witches, but of memory, because the church was trying to control knowledge, and women like Anka had too much of it. They remembered too many old things, things that blurred the line between Christian and pagan, things that connected moon cycles to harvests, things that tied dreams to medicine, breath to blood, and pain to prophecy. By the 1400s, the push for clean theology and formal medicine had reached new heights. Women were increasingly excluded from healing roles less they were nuns. Even then, only certain kinds of healing were permitted. Prayer, basic nursing, anything more complicated. And it was labeled dangerous because it was hard to regulate, hard to control, and even harder to erase. You see, knowledge passed from mother to daughter doesn't leave a trail. There are no scrolls, no licenses, no council meetings, only gestures, recipes, rhymes, a poultice wrapped a certain way, a chant repeated under the breath, a tea stirred until the color turns right. And when this kind of memory is destroyed, it doesn't scream. It simply stops being passed on, stops being believed, stops being seen as real, and eventually it becomes invisible. Today, when we read about medieval medicine, we read about Galen, about humors, about physicians in long robes debating bile and phlegm. We rarely read about the widow who knew how to heal a breached birth using a wooden spoon, hot water, and prayer. Or the girl who could soothe fevers with ground yarrow and mint soaked in goat's milk. Or the mother who rubbed garlic on her baby's feet to bring down a fever when no one else had answers. Their knowledge wasn't official, but it was real, and sometimes it worked better than anything the church or crown could offer. Even now, echoes of this memory remain in folk medicine, in lullabies, in the way some grandmothers instinctively press a hand to a forehead and know the difference between just warm and worryingly hot. There is a wisdom passed down in silence, unwritten but not forgotten, and perhaps not gone. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift, you may find yourself remembering a face you never saw, a name you never learned, a story you never read, and yet did feel familiar, like a thread tugging gently through time. Because maybe, just maybe, there's still a part of you that knows the sky. The sky. Anchor's breath faded in a season of frost. No children were there to hold her hand. No priest to speak final rites. No neighbor brought her broth. Her last companion was the steady creak of wind through the wooden eaves, the dry hiss of snow against the door, and the soft ticking sound of a pot cooling too slowly on the hearth. She died as she had lived in her final years alone, untouched, modded, but she was not forgotten. Not fully, because one morning, a child wandered too far into the woods, chasing a wren with blue-tipped feathers. She stumbled across the cottage. The herbs were still hanging. The mortar still sat on the table. And the child's mother, frightened and trembling, pulled her daughter away, but not before she saw something carved into the table. A sun, a crescent, a spiral. 3 symbols burned deep into the grain. They meant nothing to the villagers, but they meant something to someone. And a year later, a woman named Clara passed through. She'd heard whispers about a dead midwife. She found the house, lit a fire, and sat with a page of vellum. She copied the symbols, walked the rooms, pressed her fingers to the cold hearthstone where soot still clung like memory. Then she left. The house rotted slowly. But the memory did not entirely, because women like Anka were part of a chain, an invisible one, a thread running quietly beneath the louder voices of history. For every trial that burned a healer, there was a daughter who remembered. For every edict that banned herb lore, there was a song that carried it. For every inquisitor who silenced a woman, there was another who whispered the names of roots under her breath as she picked them in the moonlight. These were not witches in the modern, fantastical sense. No broomsticks, no potions to fly, no green skin or pointed hats. They were scientists of the senses. They listened to breath rhythms and knew when someone was near death. They watched cloud cover and understood when harvest would fail. They took the bitter root, the moldy bread, the boiled bark, and turned them into medicine. Not always safely, not always perfectly, but often better than anyone else would try. They didn't wear robes. They wore aprons stained with soil, and their tools weren't brass instruments or golden crucifixes. but bundles of dry time, chipped clay bowls, and the steady, calloused confidence of someone who has pulled more than one child back from the edge. But silence is powerful, and over the centuries, right, that silence deepened by the 1500s. Midwifery had become increasingly professionalized, but only for men, university trained. Doctors began to take over births in cities. They wrote papers, argued in Latin, viewed the body as a mechanical system of valves and fluids. They dismissed the intuition of women as superstition, ignored centuries of practical experience because it lacked formal citation. And still, women birthed alone or with other women in rooms filled with steam and cries and linen soaked in blood. No textbooks, no gloves, no charts, just hands. Hands that felt, that waited, that knew when to push and when not to. But hands could not hold back the tide as states centralized power and churches doubled down on orthodoxy. Anything unlicensed became dangerous, including memory, including knowledge passed from mouth to ear to hand to womb. The last known major witch trials in Europe occurred in the 1700s. By then, which had become a catch-all term for any woman. Who frightened the systems that ruled over her? Old women who lived alone, young women who asked too many questions, midwives who refused to hand over their clients to male doctors, women who read, women who remembered. And still, they persisted, quietly in the corners of farmhouses, behind shuttered windows, in stories disguised as lullabies. Pick the nettle, boil the brew, mark the day, the moon turns blue. Say the word and mind your breath, or the fever brings its death. It sounds like a rhyme, but it's a recipe, a ritual, a map. Nettle for strength. Moon phase for timing, breath for diagnosis, and fever. Always the warning. In the 1800s, folk medicine saw a resurgence, this time among ethnographies. Men who went from village to village, recording songs and remedies, treating them like quaint oddities rather than what they were, survival blueprints. Some of those rhymes, pressed between pages in dusty books, later informed modern pharmacology. Willow bark for pain, honey for infection, lavender for calm. But the women who carried that knowledge, rarely named, the songs survived. Their singers did not until recently now. In the archives of certain small libraries in Europe, researchers are unearthing fragments. Not just the famous trials, but the obscure ones. The half-documented births, the petitions to allow midwives to practice, the letters from bishops who accused nuns of dabbling in dangerous knowledge. And sometimes, among the footnotes, a name appears, Anka of Blau, Felden, not a full biography, just a mention in a local priest's ledger, dated 1303. She did not attend Mass, but claimed to see God in leaves, dismissed as heretical. And yet, that sentence alone breathes. It suggests a whole worldview to see God. In leaves is not madness, it is memory, it is connection. It is the echo of older ways of knowing, where the divine was not confined to stone buildings, but lived in the frost that crusted a window pane, in the steam rising from a birthing tub, in the breath that stilled and the silence that followed. These women, the forgotten ones, may never have their names carved into monuments, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in the soft pressure of a hand across a sick child's brow, in the instinct to reach for mint when the stomach nods, in the way we still boil broth when someone is ill, even if we can't quite explain why, and in the quiet certainty, passed down without language, that healing is not always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's a murmur, sometimes it's a hand wrapped in linen, sometimes it's simply not leaving, even when the world does. So tonight, as you sleep, if you dream of a mossy house and the sound of wind brushing dried herbs, listen, that's not just the forest, that's the sound of memory surviving silence, That's the whisper of a name someone tried to erase. That's a woman who knew the sky and left just enough of herself behind for you to remember. You're standing on a wind-blown slope near the North Sea. To your left, a crumbled arch wedged two stones leaning against each other like sleeping giants. To your right, a flattened field dotted with stubborn grass and the occasional carved rock barely visible beneath the soil. There are no walls, no tower bells, no robed monks. But once this ground held a pulse, a quiet one, 1,000 years ago. Give or take, the Abbey of Skildholm stood here, founded during the gray twilight years of the early Middle Ages. What some called the Dark Ages, it was neither grand nor politically significant. No great battles were fought here. No kings were crowned or buried. Heresies burned. And yet, for nearly 3 centuries, this small abbey recorded every sunrise, every frost, every shift in wind, every passing monk, and every faltering breath. They kept time when few others did. Skildholm was born not out of glory, but out of fog, according to a monk's diary preserved by accident in a northern fishing town. The abbey was first conceived by a sailor-turned-mystic named Elric, who, after surviving a brutal shipwreck in the North Sea, claimed he saw the Virgin Mary not in the clouds or in the stars, but in a mussel shell he cracked open while starving. He wrote, her gaze was not soft, but stern, as though to say, stay and watch. So he stayed, on a bluff no one wanted, in a place where the soil was too thin for grain and too salty for fruit. Others joined him, first 2, then 7. By the end of the decade, they'd built a chapel of driftwood and limestone fragments scavenged from a Roman ruin inland. Their chants, people said, sounded like wind through hollow bones. The Abbey of Skildholm was not rich. It had no relics, no donations from noblemen, no grand scriptorium, but it had silence. And in that silence, something strange happened. The monks began to write everything down. Not grand theology, not declarations, but small things, daily things. Brother Anselm's cough worsened. Rain has fallen every day but one this month. The bees died. Today, we found another fox with black spots on its tail. That makes 4. A fisherman claims the tide has changed its voice. This was not history, as the great courts of Europe understood it, but it was time, unbroken, careful, unremarkable time. They wrote on scraps, on lambskin, on wooden tablets, if nothing else was available. Their ink was made of ash, sometimes squid ink, sometimes rust from old ship nails. Their script changed over the decades, not elegant, but functional. At first glance, it all seems ... trivial. 1,000 pages of mold patterns, of barley growth, of sea spray thickness. But then, something begins to emerge. Patterns in the years that the bees vanished. Infants died more frequently in the months where the northern winds shifted 2 weeks early. Fish harvests collapsed when 3 foxes with black spotted tails were seen within 7 days. A flood followed. The monks at Skildholm never claimed prophecy, but they did suspect rhythm. They believed, humbly, that the world spoke awfully, pouringly, continuously. They believed that God was not only in miracles, but in patterns, and for that reason, they watched. There's an entry from around 890 AD that simply says, today, nothing happened. Praise be. But the very next page records a massive storm. Broken boats, a shore layered in jellyfish, the fields salted by wind. Sometimes, the nothing meant something. And in a century when most literacy was confined to Latin and elite centers of learning, the Skildholm monks kept writing in their own script, blend of Latin structure, Norse syllables, something unique, an internal shorthand only they seemed to understand, half logical, half musical. for centuries. No one paid attention to them, and then, one day, they vanished. Not dramatically, not with fire or sword. There are no records of destruction, just ... A final note. Brother Evan went out to check the sea ice. He did not return. We will wait one more day. That's the last page. It's dated around 1033 AD, and after that, nothing. The abbey disappears from maps. Metropolis stopped mentioning it. Coastal directories omit it entirely. The field where it once stood became pasture. Then bog, then silence. The only reason we know it ever existed is because a single cod fisherman named Maroon found a strange chest in the 1800s. It had floated ashore, waterlogged, barnacled, covered. He opened it and found pages not valuable ones, not illuminated or bound in leather, just damp, disintegrating leaves of inked vellum. He used some of them to patch shoes. One he sold to a traveling scholar who recognized a strange blend of Norse and ecclesiastical Latin. That scholar tracked the pattern, dug deeper, and slowly, over years, a story emerged not of one great man, not of conquest or collapse, but of stillness. Skeldholm's monks had done what few dared to do. They'd listened, not for glory, but for rhythm. That's what makes them strange in history. Not what they did, but what they didn't. They didn't build towers. They didn't fight wars. They didn't seek power, didn't chase miracles. They simply watched. And because they did, we now have the earliest long-duration climate log in Northern Europe. Their pages mention sea temperature shifts centuries before formal records. They note changes in migratory bird patterns. They document the appearance of a dark sea foam, the same foam that later oceanographers associate with red tides and marine toxicity. They even captured what appears to be the beginning of the medieval warm period, noted not in scientific terms, but in the growing presence of mosquitoes, the changes in butter consistency, and the fact that for 3 summers in a row, ice did not return to the SHLLOWS. Their boring notes now inform serious academic research, and still, no one knows why they stopped. Some suggest the sea rose and took them. Others think they were absorbed by a larger abbey inland. A few claim famine, plague, or slow migration, but their silence is complete, and that's what makes them haunting. Because the world kept turning. Empires rose, kings fell, cities burned and were rebuilt. But the rhythm those monks observed, Adine, never stopped out tonight. It continues, in the tides you don't think about, in the soil cycles below your city, in the way that even now, your breath is part of a pattern you've never consciously noticed. You're living in rhythm, just like they did. And if you ever find yourself standing on a quiet bluff with only wind and distant gulls for company, and you notice the sea has changed its voice, listen, not for drama, but for pattern, because somewhere beneath the louder parts of history, a pulse is always recording, even now, even here, even in sleep, in sleep. It's hard to understand silence the way the monks of Skeldholm did. We often think of silence as absence, as the lack of sound, activity, or significance. But in the old language of these monks, the word they used most often wasn't silence. It was stillness. A different idea entirely. Stillness is not empty. Stillness holds wind between gusts. It holds time between clocks. It holds meaning between the lines of things that aren't written, and echoes in the spaces where nothing seems to happen. And for the monks who stood on that coastal edge, for nearly 3 centuries, stillness wasn't something they endured, was something they pursued. They lived, essentially, in a time of noise. Yes, even during the so-called Dark Ages, while warlords carved up the remnants of Roman Britain, and Viking raiders stormed through monastic communities elsewhere. while the Carolingians tried to standardize Latin across kingdoms, and while the first hints of Arabic numerals reached Northern Europe's Guildhall, wrote none of it down, not because they didn't know, but because they chose not to react. In one surviving entry from the year 842, a monk named Odilbert noted, "Today we saw sails to the south, red cloth, carved dragon head. The wind did not shift. We stayed inside." That's all he wrote. Elsewhere, this mitave prompted an evacuation, a call to arms, a warning bell. But not here. There is no indication the abbey was attacked. No accounts of pillage. No interruption in the daily entries. The next line, dated one day later, simply reads, "Brother Thomas says the beetroot failed again. We will salt fish earlier this season." They had a logic different from ours. Perhaps it was defeatist, or perhaps it was monastic discipline at its most extreme. But what emerges across decades of such entries is a remarkable focus. The idea that large-scale events weren't always the most significant ones. Instead, they seemed convinced that it was the small signs to slow changes that truly revealed how the world worked. If you follow their writings carefully, you notice how often they measured the world in rhythms: the duration of sea spray drying on stone, the number of breaths between thunder and rain, the time it took for wax to harden once the sun dipped behind the cliffs, how long it took a cold floor to return to warmth after morning prayers. They were, in a very real sense, timing the earth. They didn't have clocks. Their concept of time wasn't minute by minute, but it wasn't vague either. It was layered, cyclic. You could see it in the way they structured the year, while nearby abbeys followed standard liturgical calendars structured around feast days, saints' days, and harvest cycles. Scoldholm's records show they layered those calendars with their own observational rituals. For example, they noted what they called the 11-day tide, a mysterious cycle where, roughly every 11 days, the sea fog would roll in more thickly and insects would behave differently. In later centuries, scientists studying coastal microclimates found similar unexplained weather rhythms. Two deep-sea pressures in lunar cycles. The monks didn't understand the mechanism, but they noticed the signal. Another recurring pattern involved the silent wind. Once or twice a year, a strange phenomenon occurred where the sea wind would pause for nearly an entire day, something exceedingly rare on that coastal slope. During these windless hours, the monks would gather outside in silence, observing the birds and the behavior of animals. One entry reads, "No gulls, no sheep sounds. Even Brother Wilrich's cough did not echo." They called this moment the quieting, and they believed it marked the turning of the earth's breath. We might now interpret that as a moment tied to atmospheric stillness or pressure shifts preceding a storm or seasonal change. But to them, it was sacred. They lived attuned to subtlety. But while their sensitivity was remarkable, it wasn't just a mystical practice. It had real, practical effects. Their records, when plotted across centuries, show accurate patterns of famine years, disease, outbreaks, and ecological stress long before those events were felt by nearby towns. For example, in the early 900s, the monks began noting an increase in what they called night sweats among villagers who visited to trade fish or candles. At first, the monks simply observed and prayed, but then they began isolating their own elderly monks, keeping them indoors longer, and increasing garlic rations. Garlic, not for taste, but for what they believed was its heat, something protective. Now, centuries later, we recognize that many plagueira preventatives involved garlic, bacterial in property, antifungal in some use. They didn't understand microbiology, but they understood cause and effect, observation, pattern, caution. Even their architecture reflected this quiet rhythm. Unlike soaring cathedrals with stained glass and bell towers, Khan's buildings were squat, low, and slightly sunken into the earth. Most walls were reinforced with sea, clay, and moss to retain warmth. The chapel had no steeple, only a central oculus that let light fall like a sundial on the floor, allowing the monks to track daylight shifts, throughout the year without speaking a word. The entire complex was designed to feel like a pause, not a stop, but a breath held just long enough to notice. And their isolation wasn't total. Fishermen, lost travelers, and weather-worn messengers passed through on occasion. Skilled homes, monks often gave shelter, but rarely did these visitors stay. One Norse saga fragment speaks of a warrior who spent 3 nights there during a storm. When he left, he told his companions, "They do not speak to Odin. They do not speak to Christ. They listen to the sea and whisper into stones." It was meant as mockery, but perhaps it wasn't far off. The monks did whisper to stones, yes, but also to time. One fascinating note from a later monk, one of the last ones, it seems, describes a ritual they called the listening. Each week, one monk would climb to a particular ridge overlooking the sea, lie flat on his side, and listen for 6 hours without movement. No writing, no talking, just listening. He would then return and report what he heard, what he felt, and what, if anything, had changed. Most entries are simple, fewer goals. Rock beneath my elbow was warm longer than last week. Salt taste in air faded before sunset. Sound of crabs not heard. Again, boring details, but they saw them as a kind of scripture for a people stripped of traditional power deeds. Monks had no armies, no land rights, no political leverage. Their only agency lay in noticing, in recording what others dismissed. And in doing so, it quietly created a kind of counter-history, one that wasn't written by victors, but by witnesses. Eventually, as the first millennium came to a close, their writing began to take on a different tone, less frequent, more urgent. Around 1010 AD, entries began to reference the warming. At first, it was just odd weather. Bees came early. Snow melted before candles mass. Sea ice did not return this year. Then, by 1022, Brother Arn says, he feels the sun's shape has shifted. Fish have swum deeper. Nets must go farther. Skin burns after 10 minutes on south wall. Today, we interpret these as indicators of the medieval warm period era of rising temperatures that reshaped European agriculture and sea routes. The monks didn't know the causes, but they knew it meant to change. Their final entries are laced with ambiguity. Some speak of preparing for travel inland. Others suggest waiting. One line reads, "We cannot chase stillness. It must be carried." And then, silence. No more ink, no more breath, only wind. And now, you're the one listening. You're lying on that ridge. Or maybe you're not, but some part of you is. Some quiet part that feels how the world hums beneath its louder surface. The monks believed history wasn't just kings and crusades. It was in the thickness of salt air. In the time it took a candle to melt. In the echo of a cough inside a chapel with no steeple dot. And now, centuries later, their silence is louder than the rest because it endures. The ruins of Skeldholm are barely there. Even now, after 1,000 winters, after 1,000 storm tides, its outline still lingers like a pressed palm on an old piece of cloth. You have to walk slowly to feel it. There's no marked trail, no signpost, just sea wind and low grass that hide stone beneath its roots. Some of the locals say it's cursed. Others say it's blessed, but most just say nothing at all, because to speak of Skeldholm is to disturb something fragile. And here, silence has grown thick. It's not the absence of sound, it's the presence of memory. So old, it doesn't need language anymore, and the ruins. They breathe. The chapel, if you can find it, is only waist high now. Its northern wall has been devoured by ivy, and the once rounded oculus is just a hole filled with sky. But if you step inside and close your eyes, you'll still feel the temperature shift. Slight, but real. A coldness that doesn't come from shade or breeze, but from stone that once remembered prayer. There's a smooth groove in the floor where generations of monks must have knelt. One knee, always the right. They must have taken turns, or perhaps they didn't need to. Keyed the way. No other part of the abbey shows such wear. And here's what's strange. In all the years since the last monk wrote his final line, no moss has grown in that groove. Everything else has been swallowed. Floor, tiles covered, wooden beams rotted up. But that one hollow where knees met earth is clean, as if the earth remembers that it was shaped by devotion and will not take it back. The first archaeologists who came here tentatively, respectfully expected to find buried relics, vellum scraps, metal chalices, forgotten altars. DIDN, single quotes, T. Instead, they found absence, and not the kind that feels empty, the kind that feels curated, almost as if the monks, their final months, erased themselves on purpose, as if they knew they were disappearing and wanted it to be total. No remains were found, no graves, no personal items, no scraps of cloth, nothing buried beneath the chapel where monks were usually laid. One theory suggests they walked inland to a monastery in the forest, or across the fjords to another order. But if they did, they left no record. Not a single name appears in nearby annals. No Brother Arne, no Tomas, no Wilrik. They vanish like fog in wind, but they left one thing behind. A wall, not of stone, not of words, but of silence, so thick it echoes. Locals say birds avoid flying over Skildholm, a gate that compasses twitch near its southern field. That the wind always quiets for a moment when you step onto the chapel floor. You might think it's superstition, but even now, scholars who visit to study the atmospheric data or to chart migratory paths all report the same thing. Equipment stops working here. Not violently, just subtly. Batteries fade, GPS pings slow, watches lag by seconds, and when they leave, everything works again. Some of them laugh it off, some don't come back, but there's something else here too. Not haunting, not divine, just a stillness that refuses to break. In the small museum 10 miles inland, there's a single glass case. Inside it, the only artifact confirmed to come from Skaldholm, a wax tablet, so worn it's barely readable, but under a specific angle of light. If you look closely, you'll see what they found carved into it, not with stylus, but with fingernail dot. It says, "We do not live to be remembered. We live to remember." And beneath it, no signature, only the faint shape of a Fishan old Christian sign drawn sideways. Not as a symbol of faith, but of continuity, motion, rhythm. The fish swims forward, and that's what Skaldholm was. Not a monument, not a warning, but a rhythm. Written across generations of monks who understood that time doesn't move like a book, but like breath, in and out, with pauses, with patterns. Even after they vanished, those patterns persisted. In 1191, a farmer 2 valleys inland noted in his private ledger that my oxen refused to cross the stream today, as they sometimes do when the winds turn west. He didn't know it, but the day he described matches what Skaldholm monks once called the quieting. 300 years later, in 1490, a sailor's logbook from the coast describes the water being too still to feel real. Even the barnacles clung to rock with a kind of fear. And again, in 1814, a schoolteacher leading a geology walk near the ruins told students, "Do not speak here. Even the air seems listening." She wrote that line in the margin of her notebook. It wasn't part of the lesson. It wasn't scientific, but it tells us something. The stillness remains, and that's what makes this ruin different from all the others. Not its size, not its age, but the fact that it chose to vanish slowly. It wasn't destroyed in war. It wasn't buried by fire. It wasn't toppled by greed or plague or kings. It was simply released like a breath held too long. The last generation of monks at Skildholm didn't try to build a legacy. They didn't seal scrolls in stone or leave dramatic messages behind. They didn't petition the Vatican or mark their names on world maps. They just stopped, but the world remembered anyway, because some silences are louder than bells now. When the sea wind passes through what remains of their chapel, it sometimes howls low through the broken oculus. Just one note, tone so steady it feels tuned. The villagers call it the monk's breath, and those who've heard it say it sounds less like a warning and more like a promise that nothing is ever truly lost, only quiet. And if you listen, truly listen, you'll find that even silence has shape, even ruins can whisper, even the forgotten remember.